In the early hours of July 4, 1954, the idyllic facade of a lakefront home in Cleveland, Ohio, was shattered by an act of savage brutality. Marilyn Sheppard, 4 months pregnant, was bludgeoned to death in her bed. Her husband, Dr. Sam Sheppard, claimed he wrestled with a bushy-haired intruder before being knocked unconscious in the dark. But the blood had barely dried before a different kind of predator descended upon the crime scene. The local press did not merely report the murder, they seized it, weaponized it, and transformed a criminal investigation into an unprecedented public spectacle. The battle for justice was about to be drowned out by a media circus, setting the stage for one of the most fiercely debated legal sagas in American history. The machinery of the state mobilized under the intense glare of front-page editorials that relentlessly demanded an arrest. Before formal charges were even filed, the Cuyahoga County coroner convened an inquest to publicly interrogate the prime suspect. This was not a quiet, procedural fact-finding mission held in a sterile government office. It was staged in a local high school gymnasium, packed with hundreds of jeering spectators, and broadcast live on television and radio. Dr. Sheppard, still visibly recovering from a fractured neck and facial injuries sustained on the night of the murder, was subpoenaed to testify. He was questioned relentlessly for hours without the presence of his legal counsel, a stark deviation from standard investigative protocols that immediately signaled the erosion of his constitutional protections. When the grand jury eventually indicted Dr. Sheppard for first-degree murder, the prosecution built its case almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and character assassination. The state possessed no murder weapon, no blood from the victim on Sheppard's clothing, and no definitive motive. Instead, prosecutors capitalized on the public revelation of Sheppard's extramarital affair, framing him as a desperate, deceitful man seeking a violent exit from his marriage. They argued that the lack of forced entry and the specific staging of the bedroom pointed exclusively to an inside job. The state's legal strategy relied heavily on amplifying the moral outrage already stoked by the newspapers, substituting forensic certainty with a compelling, easily digestible narrative of betrayal. The defense team countered by leaning on the physical evidence of a violent struggle, but their arguments were effectively muffled by the roar of public opinion. Sheppard's attorneys pointed to the doctor's severe injuries, verified by medical professionals, as absolute proof of his violent encounter with an unknown intruder. They highlighted a bloody footprint found in the house that did not match Sheppard's shoes, and traces of blood on the basement stairs that suggested a fleeing suspect. Yet, presenting exculpatory evidence, material that tends to exonerate a defendant, proved futile in a courtroom where the jury had been marinating in sensationalist headlines for months. The trial itself, presided over by Judge Edward Blythen, stripped away the solemnity of the judicial process entirely. The physical layout of the courtroom was altered specifically to accommodate the press. A long table was erected inside the bar, mere inches from the defense table, allowing reporters to overhear private, privileged conversations between Sheppard and his lawyers. Photographers were permitted to flash bulbs during critical testimonies, and broadcasters set up temporary studios in the courthouse corridors. Judge Blythen, facing an upcoming election, repeatedly refused defense motions for a change of venue or a continuance to let the public hysteria cool. According to later sworn affidavits, the judge even confided to a prominent columnist before the trial began that Sheppard was, quote, guilty as hell. Under these suffocating conditions, the fundamental mechanism of voir dire, the preliminary examination of prospective jurors to ensure impartiality, collapsed. The names and home addresses of all potential jurors were published in all 3 major Cleveland newspapers, subjecting them to letters and phone calls from a rabid, opinionated public. During the trial, jurors were not sequestered. They went home every single night, fully exposed to radio broadcasts dissecting the day's testimonies and editorial cartoons depicting the defendant as a cold-blooded monster. The psychological pressure on the jury was immense. Delivering an acquittal in that environment would have required defying the collective wrath of an entire city. On December 21, 1954, after days of deliberation in a highly charged atmosphere, the jury returned its verdict. They bypassed the first-degree murder charge, instead finding Dr. Sam Sheppard guilty of murder in the second degree. He was immediately sentenced to life in prison. The gavel fell, but it did not signal the triumph of the adversarial system. It marked the successful execution of a conviction by newspaper. The legal system had capitulated to the mob, trading the rigorous standards of reasonable doubt for the swift satisfaction of public demand. The fallout was swift and devastating, destroying the remnants of the Sheppard family. Within weeks of the conviction, Sheppard's mother died by suicide, unable to bear the public disgrace and the profound loss of her son. His father died of a bleeding gastric ulcer shortly after. Sheppard himself was transferred to the Ohio Penitentiary, a disgraced physician stripped of his medical license, his family, and his freedom. For a decade, he languished behind bars, filing multiple appeals that were systematically rejected by the Ohio state courts, which stubbornly refused to acknowledge the procedural nightmares that defined the original trial. The trajectory of the case shifted dramatically in 1961 with the arrival of a brash young attorney named F. Lee Bailey. Bailey recognized that arguing the forensic minutiae of the murder was a losing battle in the appellate courts. Instead, he engineered a brilliant legal pivot. He filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in federal court, a complex legal maneuver demanding that the state justify the prisoner's continued detention. Bailey's argument bypassed the question of factual guilt or innocence entirely. He argued that the state of Ohio had fundamentally violated Sheppard's rights under the 14th Amendment, which guarantees due process of law by failing to protect him from the inherently prejudicial media circus. This appellate strategy demanded a rigorous dissection of the trial record, focusing entirely on the systemic failures of the presiding judge. Bailey compiled thousands of pages of newspaper clippings, radio transcripts, and photographs, presenting them not as evidence of the crime, but as undeniable proof of a contaminated judicial environment. He demonstrated how the press had published inadmissible evidence, including false allegations that Sheppard had refused a lie detector test, a fact strictly forbidden from being presented to a jury. The argument was clear. The state had allowed the press to assume the role of prosecutor, judge, and jury, rendering the actual trial a mere formality. The federal district court agreed with Bailey, declaring the 1954 trial a mockery of justice and ordering Sheppard's immediate release. However, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that decision, reinstating the conviction and forcing Sheppard back into legal limbo. The battle lines were drawn for the ultimate showdown. In 1966, the United States Supreme Court granted certiorari, agreeing to hear the landmark case of Sheppard versus Maxwell. The highest court in the land was now tasked with answering a profound constitutional question. At what point does the First Amendment right to a free press fatally collide with the Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial? In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court delivered a blistering indictment of the Ohio judicial system. Justice Tom C. Clark, writing for the majority, systematically dismantled the legitimacy of the initial trial. The court ruled that Judge Blythen had failed to fulfill his fundamental duty to protect the defendant from inherently prejudicial publicity. The opinion famously described the courtroom environment as a carnival atmosphere, explicitly condemning the arrangement that allowed reporters to overrun the physical space of the trial. The court did not declare Sheppard innocent. It declared that he had never received a trial by an impartial jury. The ruling sent shockwaves through the American legal establishment, instantly establishing a new, enduring precedent. It mandated that trial judges take proactive, sometimes aggressive measures to insulate juries from media influence. The Supreme Court outlined specific remedies that are now standard practice across the country, including changing the trial venue, granting continuances, strictly regulating the conduct of journalists within the courtroom, and sequestering the jury. The decision fundamentally altered the balance of power in high-profile cases, ensuring that the scales of justice could no longer be tipped by the weight of newspaper ink. With the conviction officially overturned, the state of Ohio chose to retry Dr. Sheppard in the fall of 1966. This second trial was a stark contrast to the chaotic spectacle of the previous decade. Presiding Judge Francis Talty ran a tightly controlled courtroom, strictly enforcing the new mandates established by the Supreme Court. The press was relegated to designated seating far away from the defense table. Cameras were banned from the courtroom entirely, and the jury was carefully shielded from all external influences. The theatrical noise had been silenced, leaving only the cold, hard facts of the case to be debated. In this sterilized environment, F. Lee Bailey launched a devastating counteroffensive against the state's aging evidence. He introduced advanced forensic concepts that were virtually unknown during the first trial. Bailey brought in Dr. Paul Kirk, a pioneering criminologist who presented a meticulous blood spatter analysis of the crime scene. Dr. Kirk testified that the specific distribution of blood on the bedroom walls proved the killer was left-handed. Sam Sheppard was right-handed. Furthermore, Kirk identified a large blood spot on the wardrobe door that did not match the blood type of either Marilyn or Sam Sheppard, scientifically corroborating the presence of a third person in the room. Bailey then ruthlessly cross-examined the original investigators, exposing the severe limitations and biases of the initial police work. He forced veteran detectives to admit on the stand that they had never thoroughly searched the neighborhood for the bushy-haired intruder, nor had they adequately tested the forensic anomalies found at the scene. Stripped of the emotional manipulation and character assassination that had fueled the first conviction, the prosecution's circumstantial case crumbled under the weight of scientific scrutiny and aggressive defense tactics. The glaring absence of a murder weapon and the lack of direct evidence tying Sheppard to the crime were no longer obscured by media hysteria. On November 16, 1966, after a trial that relied on jurisprudence rather than journalism, the jury reached its verdict. In less than 12 hours, they found Dr. Sam Sheppard not guilty. 12 years after he was branded a monster by the front pages, the legal system finally delivered an acquittal. The courtroom remained orderly and quiet, a silent testament to the constitutional guardrails that had been painstakingly erected in the intervening decade. The man who had lost a massive portion of his life to a compromised system walked out of the courthouse a free citizen. Yet the victory was deeply tragic. Dr. Sheppard emerged from prison a broken man, battling severe alcoholism and the lingering psychological trauma of his wrongful incarceration. He died just 4 years after his acquittal, at the age of 46. His story remains one of the most haunting true crime sagas in American history, not merely because of the unsolved murder at its center, but because of the profound institutional failures it exposed. The case stands as a permanent, glaring warning. It is a relentless reminder that the pursuit of justice requires more than just a courtroom. It demands an unwavering commitment to due process, fiercely protected against the deafening roar of the crowd.